Now I would like to present Sherelle Ducksworth, current PhD student in systematic theology. Thank you, Sherelle.
Thanks, Aaron. The doctrine of sin asks questions about original sin, imputation, and the consequences of sin, namely the extent of guilt, pollution, and corruption. Recent conversations on systemic injustices has caused a growing number of Christians and churches to wrestle with the concept of social sin. In light of these conversations, revisiting the doctrine of sin is a helpful and necessary action for Christians who seek to participate in contemporary conversations on sin. Since the late 19th century, a small number of theologians have attempted to address social sin while simultaneously discussing the nature, imputation, and consequences of sin. Specifically, Walter Rauschenbusch, Walter T. Connor, and Dolores Williams incorporate social sin in their doctrine on sin. These theologians were selected to demonstrate the treatment of social sin within different theological traditions and to juxtapose their conclusions against conclusions made by Herman Bavinck in his doctrine of sin, which will illustrate that Bavinck offers a more adequate treatment on the doctrine of sin. In different ways, the doctrine of sin of Rauschenbusch, Connor, and Williams each reject a traditional aspect of the doctrine of sin. However, Herman Bavinck provides a doctrine of sin that upholds the traditional elements of original sin, imputation, and the consequences of sin, while adequately addressing social sin. The thesis of this paper asserts that Herman Bavinck's organic ontology leads to an organic hamartiology that necessitates original sin, a federal theory of imputation with an acknowledgement of realism and inherited guilt and corruption, as well as identifies social sin as an organic outcome of original sin. To argue for this thesis, I will present a brief survey of the hamartiology of Walter Rauschenbusch, Walter T. Connor, and Dolores Williams, highlighting their views on original sin, imputation, and the consequences of sin to illustrate the insufficiencies in their assertions about sin. Next, this paper will discuss Bavinck's organic ontology and the nature of humanity as an organism. I will then move to Bavinck's doctrine of sin to demonstrate the organic nature of sin and discuss social sin as an organic outflow of original sin. Finally, I will consider the implication of Bavinck's conclusions, paying particular attention to adding social sin as a category in future doctrines on sin, considering the remedy for social sin, and questions about the individual responsibility for social sin. Liberal theologian Walter Rauschenbusch was a central figure in the social gospel movement of the early 20th century. He dedicated a number of his writings to developing a theology that took the social problem into theological consideration. Rauschenbusch accused traditional theology with overemphasizing the individual dimension of salvation, conversion, and sin, and pushed for a social salvation and a doctrine of sin that accounted for the social dimension of life. In his work, Rauschenbusch redeveloped a doctrine of sin, casting off what he perceived as a hyper-focus on individual sin, though it should be noted that he did not deny individual sin. To Rauschenbusch, sin is both individual and social and comes from one original source, though the Bible does not concern itself with identifying Adam as the source of original sin. Consequently, the imputation of sin is both biological, whereby evil flowed down through the generations through channels of biological coherence, and social, whereby sin runs down the generations by social assimilation. Regarding original guilt, he denied the transmission of original guilt, which he charges the old theology as wrongly imputing to all men and women. Southern Baptist theologian and educator Walter T. Connor published two books titled The Gospel Doctrine and The Gospel of Redemption, and provided a theology on sin. Connor affirmed original sin on account of the racial solidarity between Adam and his descendants. Original sin means that the human race and all its individual members have fallen. Connor claims since Adam was the natural head and source of the race as a whole inherits a depraved nature from him. However, Connor rejects both the federal and natural theory of imputation of sin because he finds no biblical evidence for such theories. Additionally, while he embraces the idea that Adam's descendants inherited a corrupt nature, he rejects any notion that Adam's descendants inherits his guilt. Dolores Williams is an African-American womanist theologian within the Liberation theological tradition, whose theological commitments center on constructing theology for African-American women. In the book, Troubling in My Soul, Womanist Perspectives on Evil and Suffering, Williams lays out a womanist notion of sin because womanist theologians utilize African-American sources alongside the Bible in their theological development. Williams uses slave narratives, ex-slave autobiographies, and James Cone to construct a doctrine of sin. From the slave songs, she deduces sin has something to do with the trouble and burdens the slaves have to bear, but there is no notion that sin will be passed down from generation to generation because of Adam's sin in the garden. From the ex-slave autobiographies, as well as the work of James Cone, Williams notices a focus on collective social sin. Williams explains that neither the autobiographies nor Cone speaks of individual sin. Rather, Cone, like the spiritual songs, speak of sin in a communal or collective sense. Concluding her doctrine of sin, Williams' womanist notion of sin focuses on social and collective sin, and she defines individual sin as participation in society's system of devaluing Black women. There is no original sin, and the guiltiness of sin lies on the side of society at large. Herman Bavinck is a Dutch Reformed theologian whose theology is replete with his organic motif. The organic motif refers to the existence of created reality that comes from one unified source, but exists in a multitude of parts that are connected with each other and influence each other reciprocally, forming an organism. Bavinckian scholar James Eglinton affirms Bavinck's organic motif in his book, Trinity and Organism, towards a new way of reading Herman Bavinck's organic motif, and identifies a central feature of the organism as one of simultaneous unity in diversity. The organism gets its shape from the triune God. The nature and identity of the organism relies on the triune creator, whose being consists of unity and diversity within the Godhead. Consequently, all of creation exists as an organism shaped after the triune God. Specifically, humans are vestiges or imprints of the triune God in creation, displaying the unity and diversity of the triune God through their organic ontology. Bavinck's organic ontology begins with his theology on human origins. In Bavinck's treatment of human origins, the unity of the human race allows humanity to exist as an organism. In other words, in order for humanity to be an organism, humans must come from one source. Appealing to creationism, Bavinck writes, organic creationism identifies all men as organic members of humanity, and it upholds the unity of the human race in its entirety through the progenitor Adam. The historical Adam is the originator of the human race, and the unity of humanity depends on his headship as the father of humanity. Bavinck states that humanity cannot be conceived as a completed organism unless it is united and epitomized in one head, because all humanity must refer back to one source of origin. Adam's headship is twofold, involving both a physical and ethical aspect. Consequently, man's organic origin means that all men and women take their physical and ethical condition from Adam, and thus are united in Adam physically and ethically. Adam's physical headship means that Adam is the physical father of all men and women, who thereby are his physical descendants. The physical unity of the human race comes from a blood relation traced to the first Adam in Genesis 2. Therefore, human origin is rooted in the physical headship of Adam, and fosters a physical unity despite the diversity of people groups, nationalities, and ethnicities. Bobbing elaborates on the nature of this unity and its consequences, writing, in the first place, remember, humanity is not an aggregate of individuals, but an organic unity, one race, one family. God created all of us from one man. We are not a heap of souls piled on a piece of ground, but all blood relatives of one another, connected to one another by a host of ties, therefore conditioning one another and being conditioned by one another. Though the physical headship brings human unity, it is not enough to constitute humanity as an organism. The ethical headship and unity is necessary and solidifies humanity as an organism. Ethical headship refers to Adam serving as the representative of humanity in his subjection to the divine law and the covenant of works. Together in Adam, humanity is obligated to live in fellowship with God primarily in accordance to the covenant obligations and to live with one another under God's law secondary. Bavinck asserts specifically, the ethical unity is the universal subjection of man to the divine law, the covenant of works, the experience of divine grace, and man's obligation to his fellow man. The ethical nature of humanity placed Adam within two spheres, the religious life and the moral life. Bavinck defines a religious life as concerning one's relationship with God that operates in the arena of the mind and cultivates reverence, prayer, etc. Here, God is the immediate object. The moral life is secondary and involves God's intention for humanity to live in appropriate ethical relationships with one another. The moral life operates in the arena that cultivates affections such as justice, a sense of obligation, and order. Here, the neighbor is the object. The ethical unity causes the formation of relationships that includes families, relationships within social institutions meant to elevate and sustain life, relationships in and for the sake of the state, and relationships of and for the sake of humanity. It is because of the ethical unity of humans that humanity can exist. Bavinck writes, a person is the product of a community and does not exist alone, but has been in relation to others since before birth. Without the mutual relationship between others, we would not have existed. We are born out of, in, with, and toward various relationships. Those ethical ties are many and manifold. As an organism, humanity consists of a multitude of men and women whose origin begins in Adam as the physical head, and who live under ethical ties to God and to one another through Adam's ethical headship. However, Adam's sin set a different course for humanity. Adam's fall impacted him and his descendants, demonstrating that Adam is the source of sin, and every facet of sin organically points back to Adam's transgression. Bavinck identifies original sin as being no other than the first trespass of the first human. He makes this deduction from scripture and passages such as Romans 5, that sin is an organism and that sin originates in Adam. As the organic head of humanity, Adam's transgression is the beginning of human depravity and the source of original sin. Unlike Rauschenbusch's conclusion that Adam is not identified as the source of original sin, and Williams' lack of attention to original sin, Bavinck sees scripture as clearly attesting to Adam as the origin of sin, and believes there can be no claim that sin is present among humans without original sin located in Adam as the organic head of humanity. Regarding the imputation of sin, Bavinck engages both the federal and natural theory. Federal headship contends that God appointed Adam as the federal head of humanity, and on this basis, man is guilty of original sin. According to Bavinck, sin is imputed from Adam to his descendants through federal headship. Because our ethical unity depends on Adam as the federal head, sin is transmitted through Adam's federal headship. Though Bavinck adheres to federal theory, he does not eliminate the realist theory completely. He writes, certainly this physical oneness of the whole humanity in Adam as such is of great importance for the explanation of original sin. Realist theory is a necessity and a prerequisite. In other words, we must be connected to Adam physically to be united in his condition. But realism alone is insufficient and raises some concerns. Realism alone loses sight of individual personality and places us as responsible for all the other sins of Adam, all the sins of Eve, even all the sins of all our ancestors. Unlike Rauschenbusch, Connor, and Williams, Bavinck views the federal theory of imputation as theologically rational and provides an explanation detailing how Adam's descendants are impacted by his sin in accordance with traditional understanding. Rauschenbusch includes the social transmission of sin, and Connor rejects all theories of imputation. Because Williams does not provide a theory of imputation, a womanist notion of sin does not explain how sin can impact humanity as a whole. Thus, Rauschenbusch, Connor, and Williams leave a void in determining just how sin came to impact Adam's descendants and in what way. To Bavinck, in accordance with humanity as an organism unified in Adam, the organic federal head, sin is also a universal reality. However, even though Rauschenbusch and Connor affirm universal sin, Dolores Williams does not propose the universality of sin. As a result, Williams' work on sin leaves one to assume that universal sin is not a reality. And though Rauschenbusch affirms universal sin, it includes the universality of social sin without accounting for individual culpability for social sin. Regarding the transmission of guilt and pollution, Bavinck affirms inherited guilt and corruption passed down to Adam's descendants through his organic federal headship. Passages such as Psalm 51, Romans 1, and 1 Corinthians 15 affirm the reality of original guilt and pollution for Bavinck. Both Rauschenbusch and Connor deny that men and women inherit guilt and corruption from Adam. This denial proves problematic for both Rauschenbusch and Connor, making their suggestions about the impact of Adam's sin and the extent of his sin difficult to explain. For Williams, it can be deduced that men and women inherit the corruption of the society in which they exist and are guilty once they participate in the social sin of devaluing Black women. Unfortunately, Williams does not discuss sin in general or individual terms, but only specifically and collectively. Bavinck defines social sin as a sin that appears throughout human relationships in society. It should be noted that relationships here include the spaces in the social spheres that involve all human interaction. As an aspect of the organism of sin, social sin stems from original sin. Adam's fall changed the course of human ethical relationships. As mentioned earlier, the organic nature of humanity binds men and women together physically and ethically. The physical and ethical unity of the human race places humans into relationships with one another. These relationships include families, societies, and nations, each involving an ethical character and existing within the moral life of men and women. To grasp Bavinck's understanding of social sin, listen to these quotes from his book, Our Reasonable Faith. Bavinck states, "This organic view is applicable also to the sins which manifest themselves in particular areas of human life. There are personal and individual sins, but there are also common social sins, the sins of particular families, nations, and the like. Every class and status in society, every vocation and business, every office and profession brings with it its own peculiar dangers and its own peculiar sins. But this precisely goes to show that all those sins in each sphere are interdependent with each other." Again, he states, there are personal characteristics, but there are also social characteristics peculiar to a given circle of people. There are particular individual sins, but there are also general social sins. And thus, too, there is individual guilt, but also common social guilt. Social sins are the presence of individual sins that flows into human relationships, including families, societies, the state, and nationalities. Bavinck does not merely mean that social sins involve individual sinners existing in the social space. Instead, social sins involve individual sinners living unethically in their many relationships and utilizing their sin to create and cultivate sin in every aspect of the social sphere. Social sins are organic for two reasons. First, social sins are organic because they stem from Adam's original sin. Second, social sins are organic because all sins are related to one another and never existing in isolation, affecting more than the person responsible. Bobbing sums up these two reasons, stating, inasmuch as they come up out of a single root, all the sins in the life of each person individually, and thus also in the life of a family, generation, race, people, society, and the whole of mankind are organically related to each other. But however they may differ from each other, they never stand by themselves as sheer arbitrary entities, each in discrete isolation. They are always at bottom interrelated, the one influencing and leaving its mark on another. The juxtaposition of Bavinck's doctrine of sin presented and the doctrines presented by Rauschenbusch, Connor, and Williams demonstrates Bavinck's ability to uphold traditional treatment of the doctrine of sin while addressing social sin. But there are three implications or considerations pertinent to the conclusions drawn in this paper. First, the organic connection between original sin and social sin necessitates the inclusion of social sin as a category in future doctrines of sin. Second, Bavinck's work adds to the conversation concerning a remedy for social sin. It is inevitable that conversations on social sin lead to questions concerning the remedy of social sin. Unlike Rauschenbusch, who proposes an extension of salvation, Bavinck maintains the primacy of our standing before God as the central concern of salvation. However, Bavinck discourages these two extremes. He rejects the tendency of Christians to individualize their spiritual life to concerns only about prayer and seclusion from society. He also rejects the notion of kingdom realization in the here and now in the attempt to perfect the temporal world in creation. Instead of these extremes, Bavinck encourages a middle ground where Christians properly hold salvation as a concern between individuals and God while taking up the call to be in society, recreating relationships for the glory of God. Concerning individual responsibility, it is important to note that questions about individual responsibility concerning social sins are not questions that Bavinck intentionally addresses. For Bavinck, discussing social sin is not a strategy to figure out who is to blame for social ills, nor is it to rework soteriology. Instead, Bavinck is proposing sin as an organism to demonstrate how every aspect and expression of sin finds its root in Adam and to show the interconnection of sin. Bavinck's organic view of sin complements his grace within nature paradigm because it demonstrates the totality of the corruption of sin as involving not just isolated individuals, but humanity as a whole, which is visible throughout society. By highlighting social sin, Bavinck removes any notion that society is neutral. Thus, God is not only recreating humans personally, but intends for redeemed humanity to remedy the brokenness in culture caused by social sin, which organically comes from original sin passed down from the organic head Adam.